Hey, you guys, how are you? Well, I am so excited about tonight's webinar. I see a lot of you checking in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. It is straight up 6 o'clock here in Texas. I know there are people from all over Indiana, Canada, Ohio, Houston, which is near, not too far from me. One of my favorite places to visit for sure. So, a couple of things. First of all, I want to say I usually do these webinars from home, but we've been having some issues with our internet. So I told my husband, I was like, you know what? I think I'm just going to stay at work, have a late night, and do the webinar from my office. And so I'm here in my office. It's late. Nobody's here. It's a little creepy at night, but I am so excited to have this conversation about starting strong and really thinking about a roadmap that we can put in place to serve gifted learners well. So several of you are still joining. Hey, Diane, DeAndrea, always names make me nervous because I'm so afraid I'm going to mess them up. Karen, Carrie, Amanda, Leanne, Tabby, I'm so excited that you're here. So lots of people still checking in. Laura, excited that you're here as well. So, and Kim from California. So, as we get started, I just want to say that I think it's so important. You know, the beginning of the school year is that opportunity to kind of lay the foundation and start to think about what are some of these things going to look like? How can we serve our learners well? And I think it's important to really take the time to think about our gifted learners and how we can lay a foundation from the beginning of the school year to consider how we can serve them well. And that's exactly what we're going to do tonight. I have kind of packed this webinar very, very full of information and ideas and things you can implement. So we're going to go quickly. Those of you that have heard me present before, you know that tends to be just how I roll. I like to share a lot of information in a short amount of time. And so we're going to jump right in as we get started. If you haven't heard me share before, and this is the first time you've joined something of mine, like a webinar or a presentation, let me take a second to introduce myself. I'm Andi McNair, also known as a meaningful mess. My husband always says, like, there's an adjective there that maybe shouldn't be there. Sometimes you're just a mess, and that is 100% true. But I really do believe that the work we do in our classrooms, it's important to understand that it's okay for it to be messy as long as it's meaningful. And so that's kind of where that title comes from and why it's so personal and important to me. Because that was a very real kind of aha moment I had to have in my own classroom. I always tell people I went from being a really traditional teacher that did what was easy to becoming an innovative educator that did what was best. And that was a huge shift for me, but I'm so glad that I was able to make that shift because it gave me the tools and the resources that I have now and that I spend my time sharing with educators. Okay, so here's where we're going to start. I've put a picture on your screen. There are 4 pictures, and I want you to think about gifted education on your campus or in your district. And I want you to, if you're driving, don't do this, but if you're not driving, I want you to take a second to just kind of think through. Number 1, that would be like, oh my gosh, we're so ready. Bring it on. We're super stoked about serving gifted learners. Feel 100% prepared, like we're ready to go. Number 2 is we know where we're going. We kind of know how to get there, but we're right now just kind of looking at the map and we're looking at the compass, like we're just looking at the direction and trying to make some decisions on where we're headed as a campus or district in serving gifted learners. Number 3, I think, is what a lot of us feel as gifted specialists, especially in small schools when we're the only gifted specialist. I know this was sometimes my experience. We just kind of feel lonely and already a little bit out of gas. So if that's where you're feeling, that's number 3. And number 4 is like, I can see the big picture and I know how to get there, but there's still a long way to go. So you guys tell me 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the comments. How do you feel about where your campus or district or just you yourself are when it comes to gifted education and your perspective about serving gifted learners? All right, I'm going to pause for a second and let you guys respond to that. All right, number 2. I think there might be a lot of number 2s, actually. We'll see. Yep. Hey, Emma, how are you? I'm glad you're here. Some number 3s. Yep, I've been there too. I totally know that feeling for sure. Diane, I get it. Yeah. Okay, so there's a good mix, which is kind of what I was hoping. Like we're all in different places, right? When it comes to thinking about gifted learners and how we're going to serve them this year. And I just want to say that none of these are wrong, right? Like if you're feeling like number 3, that's okay. If you're, and I don't think anybody said number 1, like we're never just like woohoo. Like there's a lot to think about and a lot to consider when it comes to serving our gifted learners. And so whether you're 2, 3, or 4, I think it's important just to acknowledge that, and let's just think through how can we maybe get to a place where we at least feel prepared and ready to take on the challenge, because that really is exactly what it is. It's challenging sometimes to serve those gifted learners. All right, so here's the plan for this evening. For those of you that like to know the plan, if you know me, I don't always stick to the plan, but this is what I think we're going to do in our next little bit of time together. We're going to talk about understanding gifted learners. And even though some of you in tonight's webinar may serve gifted learners often, and you may have a really clear understanding of who they are and what they need, I think it's important that we have the tools and the resources and the vocabulary to help explain that to other people, including parents, right? It's got to be that all-in approach. Parents have to understand, colleagues have to understand, administration has to understand, and the students themselves have to understand what it means to be gifted. We're going to talk about designing for depth. How do we do that? And how do we encourage educators on our campuses and in our districts to understand that, again, that's an all-in approach. We all have to be designing for depth, regardless of if you're a gifted specialist or you're a general education teacher, whatever that is. How do we utilize that idea of designing for depth to serve them well? We're going to talk about innovative identification, right? What are some different strategies and ideas we can use to identify giftedness? Because the reality is, y'all, there are a lot of kids that are never identified because we often approach giftedness through that traditional mindset. And while there's nothing wrong with that traditional mindset, if we're never willing to look beyond that, I worry that there are learners who are gifted and never identified, which means they're never served. And that's definitely not what we want to happen. We're going to talk a little bit about productive struggle, just because I think that's an important conversation right now and something that we can prepare for at the beginning of the school year. And then we're going to wrap up with social emotional needs of gifted learners. And then I'm going to share with you guys some other ways you can connect and continue to learn. And then we'll call it a night and I'll get some rest. Okay, so here we go. Let me get my slides going. We're going backwards. That's not good. So let's talk about understanding giftedness first. You know, I think it's important to say out loud as often as we can, like, to serve gifted learners well, we have to understand what giftedness is, but we also have to understand what giftedness isn't. And I think that's something that is a really important conversation to have on our campuses and our districts this year, is to help people understand and gain clarity around that. I spent all summer with teachers all over the country having really great conversations. And one of the biggest things I walked away with was that sometimes it's just a matter of not understanding what giftedness is and what it isn't. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time leading off talking about this. And I don't usually put a lot of words on slides, but tonight, for tonight's purposes, I was telling my colleague, I was like, oh, these slides have so many words, but I just want to make sure that I'm clear on some of these things. So first of all, what giftedness is. I love the Davidson Institute, and I love their definition of giftedness. Children who are gifted are defined as those who demonstrate an advanced ability or potential, I think that's key, in one or more specific areas when compared to others of the same age, experience, or environment. So most of us know that. There's usually a pretty clear understanding of what giftedness is, but I think sometimes there is a blurred line when we talk about what giftedness isn't. I can tell you for sure, I worked with a lot of parent groups this summer as well, and one of the conversations that I had to have so often was, we want to be really clear that giftedness is not good grades, right? They might make good grades. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but that isn't the definition of giftedness. It's not compliant behavior. It's also not perfection. I think sometimes when we find out a learner is gifted, we begin to have unrealistic expectations, which can lead to, without even being intentional about it, that perfectionistic mindset. And then guaranteed success. one of the conversations that I think we need to be having and that's really important right now is helping people understand that when a learner is gifted, that doesn't mean they're going to be gifted in everything, right? You guys tell me in the chat if you've had to have that chat with people, like, giftedness does not mean that they're going to be good at everything that they do. They may be gifted in one specific area. I think that's why the twice exceptional conversation is starting to become more of a conversation, is because we're starting to realize, like, oh, giftedness doesn't mean gifted across the board. Like, they can 100% struggle in an area or even have a disability and still be gifted. And I think so often people don't realize that. They think it's like an all or nothing, and nothing could be further from the truth. So, really helping people understand this is what it is, this is what it isn't, and saying that as often as possible. All right, you guys are saying in the chat, you definitely have to have this conversation. So, something that I just think is important and that we need to point out, and this is really something that when you have your parent meetings, your parent informational meetings, I think I would always lead off with this. Like, let's all get on the same page with what giftedness is and what giftedness isn't before we talk about anything else. So, what are some really practical things that you can do this year to help everybody get on that same page? Well, I think, first of all, having a student advisory group is a really good idea. So, giving your gifted learners an opportunity to share, hey, this is what we are experiencing on our campus or in our district as gifted learners. I think student advisory groups are a good idea with so many of our learners. But for gifted learners, especially, letting them say, like, as a gifted learner, this is what I'm experiencing. Because I think sometimes we forget that we can make assumptions, right? We can assume that this is what they're experiencing, but assumptions can sometimes lead us astray, and we may not be able to see it from their perspective. And this idea of hearing it from them and letting them lead out on some of the different ways that we serve them well can be really important. So, having a student advisory group, not a bad idea. Quality professional development, like taking time to make sure that all of your colleagues, all of your administration, everybody's on the same page of, hey, this is what giftedness is and what it isn't, right? What we just talked about. But this is why it's important on our campus and in our district, so that there's buy-in, so that everybody understands the role that they play, and it doesn't become this, oh, well, when they go to pull-out classes, that box is checked. Like, that's not how it works. They're not only gifted on Wednesday at 2 o'clock, right? They're gifted all the time. And so we want to make sure that we're serving them well. And I think that happens through quality professional learning. Letting gifted learners spend time together and being intentional about that. I don't know that I knew that was important. I've talked about that often, but I don't think I personally understood that until recently. I think it was last school year. I was meeting with some gifted learners, and this sweet little senior, she was in 12th grade at the back of the room, and she spoke up, and she had never had the opportunity to sit in a room with just gifted learners and have a conversation about, what do I enjoy about being gifted? What's hard about being gifted? And what are some of the things that we all have in common? And she said it was such an aha moment for her to realize that there wasn't something wrong with her, that she wasn't broken. There were all of these kids on her campus that were having the same experiences and the same feelings. And being in that same room, she said, here I am about to graduate, and I'm just now understanding that there are other people like me on this campus and in our district. And so that was big for her. So creating that intentional time for them to spend together, and not just creating the time for them to be together, but being intentional about the conversations that are had when they're together. So giving them some open time to play games or whatever it is, but then coming back together to have some conversation around, hey, what does this mean for me to be a gifted learner? What are some of the conversations I'd like to have with other gifted learners? And I think just the intentionality behind that is really important. And then, you guys, I don't think I've ever realized until now how important this last one is. But the more I do parent trainings, and I've started to do more of those this year, I've done more of them this year than I ever have before. This is huge. Parents do not understand always what giftedness is and they don't understand what they can do at home to support their gifted learners. And so helping them understand, that's another thing that I have had happen as well, is that, I've had parents come to me after those trainings and they said, I just didn't know that other parents were experiencing this, or I didn't know that my learner could be, struggle with dyslexia and still be gifted. And to hear you say that out loud was just a huge weight lifted off of me. And so make time and make space for those parent informational meetings. If you do one a semester, or you do one a 6 weeks, or one a 9 weeks, whatever that is, but how do you do that? How can you do that in a way that makes sense? Carrie, that's a great question. Carrie's asked in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and put this on the webinar so you guys can see it. How can I best explain and have those conversations with K2 kiddos so that they understand their giftedness? I think it just looks a little bit different in that you could do things like having them illustrate what giftedness looks like or feels like to them, reading them picture books that exhibit or demonstrate giftedness, and having conversations around that. I think it's just thinking about, how can I let them see that they're not alone, and how can I give them a place to express what it is that they're feeling and experiencing as a gifted learner. So hopefully that helps, Carrie. I think anytime, but if you want to email me, I can also send you some specific resources as well. It's a great question. Okay. All right. I'm a huge fan of Christine Fonseca. She's just great, and has this really great quote about intensity. And I think a lot of us would describe gifted learners as intense. And like I said, as I spent time with parents this summer and teachers, this was something I shared often, was this quote from Christine, and it talks about that intensity. And I love that she addresses it from both perspectives, right? We can either help them use that intensity that will allow them to achieve amazing things, or at its worst, that intensity can be the turmoil that has the power to kind of consume them, and can kind of take over and put them in a place that isn't as great as we would like for them to be in. So as we think about giftedness, I think intensity, or the word intense, is a really good conversation to have with them, and helping them know that that intensity isn't a bad thing. That's one of the things my daughter sometimes struggles with, emotional intensity. And that's a big conversation we have at home, is there is nothing wrong with that intensity. We just want to make sure we're utilizing it for good. And we want to make sure we address it and know when it's happening, and understand it's not a bad thing. It's just part of who we are. But I do think that's a key conversation to have with everyone involved in serving gifted learners, is when we're talking about what giftedness is, intensity, or them being intense, is a big piece of the puzzle. Do you guys agree? How do y'all feel about that word intensity? Is that how you would describe a lot of your gifted learners, as intense? Just tell me yes or no in the chat. Okay, I'm going to continue moving on. I'll watch for your comments. Sometimes they take a little longer. You guys respond, and then it takes a minute to come in. Emma says yes. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and continue to move through kind of our conversation. This is something I've been sharing all summer long. And if you've heard me share this, I apologize. But I think it is a great way to help general education teachers, or anyone who is not a gifted specialist, really think through, even if that's you, right? If you work in a classroom where I like that, Laura. It is a nice way to say it, right? If you work in a classroom where you're serving several different types of learners, right? You have struggling learners, you have gifted learners, you have kids who are gifted and struggle. All of those things that can be really difficult to do. So I was actually going somewhere, I think it was in the spring, and this popped up. I actually got a picture of it. It popped up on my GPS in my car. And I remember thinking to myself, like, gosh, I wonder how often as a teacher was I willing to reroute. And what I mean by that was, I think sometimes I taught with a map mindset. And a map mindset is just that idea of, look, I'm trying to get from point A to point B. And this is how I'm going to get there. And I think sometimes that's what we do as teachers. Like, hey, here's where we are as a class. Here's where we're going. And here's the lesson that I've created to get us from here to there. And I think we kind of have to shift our mindsets to a GPS mindset, which is not how am I going to get, it's still how am I going to get from here to there, but I'm not going to look at a map and have one route. I'm going to understand that yes, I need to get from here to here, but I'm going to have to use real time data. I'm going to have to use what's happening in the moment. I'm going to have to pay attention to what my learners need to make decisions every constantly of how we're going to shift and change. Like I think about my GPS, and sometimes it'll come on and it'll say, hey, there's a faster route. Do you want to take the faster route? And that's exactly what we should be able to do for our gifted learners. And with a map mindset, we don't do that, right? It's just, oh, this is how we're getting there, point A to point B, and that's how everybody's getting there. But here's the thing, you guys, all of our learners do not have the same ETA for understanding, right? They're not all going to get to that deep understanding at the same time. And so a GPS mindset allows us to see that, yes, we're all headed to the same place, but we're not all going to get there at the same time. Some of our learners are going to get there faster. Some of them are going to get there a little slower. And we have to be able and be willing, I think, to reroute when it's necessary. So what do you guys think about that? Does that make sense? Like, having that mindset and being willing to reroute as often as we need to serve our gifted learners well, really to serve all of our learners well. The reality is sometimes my GPS comes on and it says, hey, there's a barrier up ahead and you're going to need to take a different route. And I think sometimes that's our job as educators, is to be able to see that out in front and to prepare our learners for it, or to have something planned that will help them overcome that barrier. Karen, yes, that is not uncommon. Karen says in the chat that she has gifted students who are not motivated to do anything. And that is definitely something we will talk about when we get to productive struggle. So stay tuned, Karen. We're going to get there, I promise. All right. So understanding giftedness, big part. Want to make sure that we understand what it is, what it isn't, and we want to make sure that we're rerouting based on what those learners need. So let's talk a little bit about identifying giftedness. I say this all the time, and I know I love this. When possible, make a legal U-turn. Absolutely. Great comment. So I say this often, and I know some of you have probably heard me say it, but you have kids in your classroom that may never pass a unit test. They may never do well on a worksheet, but they can go home and put a card back together, right? Or they can go home and speak 3 languages. And the reality is that is giftedness. And I think sometimes we miss the giftedness that learners have because it doesn't fit into the school box, right? Because they don't do the things in the classroom as well as we think that they should, or as well as certain whatever it is that makes us think that. It's important that we understand giftedness comes in so many different forms. And so I want to spend the next bit of our time together kind of talking about what are some different ways that we can identify giftedness. And so I've really been kind of diving into and sharing about this idea of innovative identification. In other words, how do we aim to identify giftedness beyond the traditional standardized tests and academic achievements? How can we look beyond that as educators? And how can we make sure that we're identifying and serving all of our gifted learners from the perspective of what they actually need? All right, here's a quote from NAGC, the National Association for Gifted Children. I'm going to give you guys a second to read that. I'm not going to read it to you, and then we'll talk about it. What do you guys think about that? Does that make sense? And have you seen that quote before or thought about it? I just think the first sentence is so good. Giftedness is dynamic, not static. And thinking about that idea that identification needs to occur over time. I think that's really, really important and something that we need to consider. Okay. So tell me in the chat, what do you guys think about that quote? Yes, no, maybe so? I'm not a big fan of awkward silence, so I'm going to need to fill the silence with words, but you guys feel free to respond and kind of tell me what you're thinking about this quote. Yeah, kids definitely grow and change, Laura. It's so true. And again, I think this is something that people need to understand, and it's something that we don't say enough. because we assume that people know. And I'm telling you, people don't know. It is definitely something we need to make sure that we're sharing. So I want to talk about some really specific ways that you can make this happen. So let's talk first about diversified portfolios. So tell me in the chat, how many of you utilize portfolios to identify giftedness? Like, is it just yes or no? Portfolios, is that something you utilize on your campus or in your district to identify giftedness in your learners? I know some schools that use portfolios. I know some schools that do not use portfolios. Okay, so one nope. Okay, see kind of how you guys respond. Okay, yeah. No. So I really like the idea of utilizing portfolios because of the comment, DeAndrea, that you said. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think portfolios can be a great way to showcase an entire learner's story. Now, here's where I worry. I worry that sometimes we utilize portfolios in the wrong way. And I maybe shouldn't say the wrong way, in a way that may not be most useful. And let me explain what I mean by that. When we think about portfolios and the way we use them with our learners, we often tell them to put their best work in a portfolio, right? Put the things you're most proud of, put the good work. And the problem with that is that it doesn't really tell the learning journey. Because you see, when our kids graduate, when they go beyond the school system, beyond the walls of the classroom, their employers, their people who are going to hire them are not just going to want to know what they did well. That's important, but they're also going to want to know, how did you handle struggle? How did you overcome obstacles? What did you do when things got hard? And I think sometimes with portfolios, we say, hey, put your best work in here. And our kids get focused on the outcome or the product. They think, oh, I'm putting my best product into this portfolio. When sometimes their best work is the fact that they persevered through a really difficult situation to be able to overcome something that they struggled in. Like, I think the key here when it comes to diversified portfolio is telling their learning story, telling about the entire journey and not just putting in their best work. So whether you utilize these for identification or not, I do think it's a great way to tell a learner's story. Does that make sense? Diane, I see that you see it doesn't meet the state mandates for identification, but can you guys see how it can at least help us know our gifted learners well, and how it can tell their learning story if we ask them to include the right things in the portfolio? One of the things that I think about, look, I'm an educator. I don't have a diversified financial portfolio, but I have friends who do. And when I think about some of those friends, they're always talking about how it's important that they diversify their portfolio because they want to kind of maximize the return and minimize the risk. And I think in education, we want to maximize the learning and minimize the polish, right? We don't just want them to put in their polished things. We want them to have a collection that demonstrates who they are as a learner and what they're capable of doing. Okay, a strengths first mindset. Gosh, if you don't hear anything else I say this evening, I think this is huge, and it's a great way to start the school year. So a strengths first mindset means that you and your colleagues agree to say, hey, we are never going to have a conversation about a learner with each other. We're never going to have a conversation with an administrator, with a parent, or with a learner themselves that we don't talk about their strengths first. So even if I'm going in to complain about a learner and how they're being difficult or what they're not doing, I'm going to start that conversation with their strengths. And what I think that does is it sometimes helps us see our learners through a different perspective. And if we're constantly remembering and reminded to talk about their strengths first, the reality is we might see or identify strengths that we would have never seen if we were only focused on what they didn't do well. I think sometimes it's easy to get so focused on a learner's weaknesses or so focused on a learner's behavior problems or whatever it is that we're missing the strength or the gift that is staring us right in the face. And I think a strengths first mindset puts us in a place where it's not that we're never going to talk about their weaknesses or that we're never going to address those. We 100% are. But first of all, I don't know how you address a kid's weaknesses if you don't know what their strengths are. Sometimes we have to utilize those strengths to address their weaknesses, and a strengths first mindset can give us an opportunity to do that. So, what do you guys think about that? Like getting your campus and district to a place where, hey, just before you talk to me about what a kid didn't do well, can we just lead this conversation off with, can you tell me something that they do well? Or can you tell me something that you see as a strength? Can you see how that can shift the perspective and shift the culture and climate of a campus or district when it comes to some of those difficult learners that may never be identified if all we're ever talking about is their weaknesses? What do you guys think about a strengths first mindset? Yes, no, maybe so. Amanda, that's so exciting about Thrively. That's exciting. They have some exciting stuff coming up for sure. So I'll hopefully be doing a webinar on that soon. All right, what do you guys think about strengths first mindset? Yes, no, maybe so. Does it make sense? Webinars are so hard because I can't see your faces. So I'm just trying to gauge where we are and if you guys are good. And I also want to give you a little bit of time to process what I'm saying. I don't want to go so fast that perfect, Cheryl. I'm so glad you're here. Strengths first. Absolutely. Yes. And we could definitely use that. And it's a great way to start the school year for sure. All right. I don't know why sometimes we go backwards. You guys knew you weren't going to get out of this webinar without me talking about passion-based learning or Genius Hour. Look, I think it's a great way to identify strengths, gifts, interests, things that we don't typically see in a traditional classroom setting. Because oftentimes when we give our learners to pursue something that they're interested in, they have this confidence or they have this like zest for what it is that they're doing. And you'll see that learner through a completely different lens. I can think about one of my students in particular. He was just a really kind of difficult kid, but a very cool personality and had so much going for him. And he for a long time, I just couldn't figure out how to get through to him. You know, those kids, you're just trying so hard. Like, if I can just get through to him. And I'll tell you what, when we started passion-based learning or Genius Hour in my classroom, I began to see that kid from just a completely different perspective. And he began to see learning from a different perspective. Like, he wanted to be at school because he wanted to work on his project. And it just changed everything for him. And it changed everything for me and the way that I saw him and who he was as a learner. So if you haven't heard of passion-based learning or Genius Hour, I just want to say, like, man, don't sleep on Genius Hour. It has the potential to really impact us as educators and to make our classroom a place that our kids want to be. So, because this is not a Genius Hour webinar, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I do want to share some resources with you guys. Obviously, the book, Genius Hour, Passion Projects that Ignite Innovation and Student Inquiry. You can read more about that and figure out how you can get it over on my website at andymcnair.com. I also have created, I'm so excited about these, learning guides, and the learning guides are for your students to work through, right? It's a workbook that your students go through as they're going through the Genius Hour process: passion, plan, pitch, project, product, presentation. And then just recently, I released the Genius Hour Skills Enhancement Suite. And so all of the skills that you see there on your screen are addressed in this kind of guide that I've created. And it's really a different way to look at Genius Hour. It's not just about, hey, do work on the project you want, do what you're interested in. It's the intentionality of, hey, we're working on these skills as you're working on the project that you're interested in. So you guys check that out. You can go to andymcnair.com/GH resources. That's where I have all of those things. I do want to make it very clear that it is important that you've read the book before you use the learning guides or the skills enhancement suite. It'll just make it make sense. So again, check that out. The website is there. I just wanted to make sure you guys knew that those things existed. So I am so excited about those. I'm glad they're finally done. I'm always tweaking and changing them. And anytime I change them, I will always let all of you know that I've already purchased them so you can get the most updated version of what it is that I've kind of created or worked on. All right, so andymcnair.com/GH resources. You guys check that out. All right, single point rubrics, I think, is another way to sometimes identify giftedness that we may not see otherwise. And if you haven't seen single point rubrics, this is kind of where in the middle you have your expectations of whatever it is that your kids are working on. So if they are working on a project, you would have, hey, these are the parts of the project that I expect you to do, and this is the expectation for each part of that project, whatever that is. On one side of the expectations, you have this is what you could do better. On the other side of the expectations, you can have this is what you did really well. This is where you exceeded what I've asked you to do. And so you're giving your learners real feedback versus making them fit into a number, right? I think sometimes when we do the 1, 2, 3, 4 things, sometimes that's appropriate. But some assignments, it just wasn't appropriate to do a rubric, a 1, 2, 3, 4 rubric. Sometimes my kids were like a 2.5, right? Or a 3.5. And a single point rubric, I feel like gives us an opportunity to really think about our learners through those different expectations. And I think that real feedback can help us see things and consider things that we might not consider otherwise. So single point rubrics, another great way to identify different things in our learners that we might not see if we're just circling a 1, 2, 3, or 4. Does that make sense? All right. I'm going back and forth between two screens, which is making this a little bit difficult. Okay. So we're getting there, y'all. We talked about identifying giftedness. Now we're going to talk about designing for depth. You know, I talk to teachers all the time, and especially general education teachers. I know it's so hard because I was a general education teacher before I worked specifically with gifted learners. And it was so hard to meet the needs of all of my learners. And to be honest, so often I was so quick to think about the learners that needed extra support. And so I always say, like, when you're designing experiences, it's really important to think about what am I going to do if they don't understand? That's important. But it's also important to ask yourself, what are you going to do if they do understand? And so this idea of designing for depth is a conversation I have had all summer. And what that means is from the very beginning of a learning experience, we are looking for and considering how deep are our learners prepared to go, and what can I do to give our learners every learner an opportunity to go to the level of depth that makes sense for them. All right, so I always use this analogy. If you know me well, you know I'm big on analogies. This idea of if you were a surfer, right? This is, I'm not a surfer, but I think this makes sense. I did have some surfers in my sessions this summer, and they said, okay, this makes sense. And that made me feel a lot better. But I would imagine that if I was an advanced surfer, if I knew how to surf really well, and I got to the beach, I looked out at the ocean, and all I saw were like little bitty white capping waves. Maybe there were lots of different surfing instructors around me teaching beginning surfers. Like, can you imagine that we would get frustrated with that and probably pack our surfboard up and go home? It'd be like, man, there's nothing here for me. I think that's sometimes how our gifted learners feel. I think they get their board out, right? They come to school at the beginning of the year because they're so excited, like, all right, I'm excited to learn something new. And then they come to school day after day after day. And it's like, there's nothing here for me, right? This is great for everybody who needs maybe the extra support, or maybe the ones who need the extra help, or who don't need the big, advanced, exciting waves. But what about me when I'm ready for that? And so they just stand at the shoreline, just waiting. And there comes a place, I would imagine, where they get tired of waiting, and then they start getting frustrated, right? And then they become apathetic and they become disengaged. Sometimes they become difficult. Like, this is often the case with our gifted learners, and designing for depth, I think, can be the answer to that. So when I talk about designing for depth, I always talk to teachers about starting class by engaging your learners, right? As soon as they walk in the door, within the first 8 seconds, there needs to be something that makes them want to be in class. I always say this is hard to say and hard to hear, but it's really important. Like, I'm not talking about a warm-up worksheet. Nobody is stoked about a warm-up worksheet. You can do that if you want to, but don't call it the engage piece, because it's not engaging. An engage piece is something that gets our learners super stoked about what they're going to be doing in class that day. And so when they come in, that designing for depth idea starts there. I'll give you a perfect example. So let's say kids come in and I have a picture on the projector, just an image of something, I mean, anything. It could literally be a picture of anything appropriate. And so as they come in, they see that picture and I ask them to make a prediction about what they're going to be learning that day. I can tell by their predictions how deep they're thinking at the very beginning of class. So I want to be clear. I am going to talk about extensions in this part of the webinar, but designing for depth starts the minute our learners walk in the classroom. So we want to engage them as soon as they walk in. We want to design an experience that will leave an impression. We want to empower them to use what they've learned beyond the walls of the classroom. And then we have to make the decision based on the evidence that we have. Does this learner need extra support or do they need an extension? So when we think about extensions for gifted learners, extended learning should be 4 things. It should be prioritized, it should be intentional, it should be appropriate, and it should be meaningful. And I think if we're not careful, we fall into extensions being none of these things. I know that when I was in the general education classroom, because I was so focused on my struggling learners or the kids who needed my support, sometimes with my gifted learners, I tended to just be like, oh, here, just work on this project, or here, just get on this website. And I didn't understand always how important it was that I designed that extension on the front end of the learning experience. Like I need to be thinking about that in my planning so that I know, hey, when they finish early or when they've already mastered what's being taught, this extension that I'm going to give them isn't busy work. Because I'll tell you this, gifted learners recognize and resent busy work, right? They know when you're giving it to them and it makes them mad. So we don't want to give them busy work. We want to say, hey, here's the extension, but that extension should be prioritized. So we should have thought about it as we were designing the experience. It should be intentional. Hey, this learning experience is connected to what we did in class today, and it gives you an opportunity to go deeper into that content. It should be appropriate for those learners, and it should be, Carol Ann Tomlinson talks about respectful tasks, right? That's what I'm saying. It should be appropriate for those learners, and it should be respectful of who they are as learners. And ultimately, it should be meaningful, right? I've seen that. You guys have probably seen that thing going around Instagram that says gifted learners don't need more work. They need more meaningful work. And it's so true. So extensions have to be those. And I think any support we can give to educators in helping them design those is really, really important. Okay, what do you guys think about that? The different extensions, does that make sense and help you kind of think about extensions through a different lens? Hopefully so. Okay, so let me show you. This is very cool. And I struggled with like, do I put this in the webinar? Do I not? But I would not sleep tonight if I didn't tell you guys about this. So we all have heard about artificial intelligence, right? This is not a secret. It's something that we're talking about in education right now and like, how do we use it? And honestly, I want to be clear. I am not an artificial intelligence expert. Brian Housen, we do a lot of work together and he is doing tons of great work around artificial intelligence. So you guys make sure you're following him. I am not an expert on that topic, but I will tell you that I have utilized it enough to know that it is a great springboard. And that's exactly how I think we should use it as educators. So I like this idea of helping. Look, when I was a general education teacher, I had a ton of things on my plate. I didn't always have the time to think through some of the things that I'm telling you about right now. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like the plate is full. But so these pictures that you see on your screen right now, that is Chat GPT. So have you heard, how many of you have heard of Chat GPT? Just tell me yes or no in the chat. I think you're going to be really excited about this, I hope. I don't know if a lot of people have thought about utilizing it this way. Just yes or no. Have you heard of Chat GPT? Are you using it? What are your thoughts about it so far? I am really working on my wait time tonight because I really am not good at it. All right, just learned about it this week. Yes, yes. Okay, perfect. So there's some, you guys kind of understand it. If you haven't heard of it, just do yourself a favor, ChatGPT. Go check it out. So let me show you guys how I used it here. So I went into ChatGPT and I said, hey, can you create a learning experience for me about the solar system for fourth grade? Now, here's what I always want people to understand. ChatGPT is not a teacher. It does not know everything that we know as teachers. And so it's important that when you ask it to design a learning experience, that you look at that carefully and you look at it through the lens of your classroom and your learners. It is great for writing parent emails. I absolutely agree. So looking at it through the lens of, hey, is this going to work for my classroom? And then you can tweak it or make shifts to it, but it's a great way to kind of get the ideas going. So you can see that it says extension. So I had it create the learning experience. Then I said, hey, can you create an extension for this learning experience that weaves in or utilizes depth and complexity? And then I don't know if you guys can see that very well, but it gives me the extension overview. It talks about the depth and complexity icons that it was able to weave into this particular experience. And then it walks me through like, hey, here's what you're going to do. They're going to choose a solar system mystery. This is how they're going to use the icons. This is what they're going to do. And I just love it as like a springboard for an idea for an extension. And I don't think teachers always think about that. Like, I think we get it to like, hey, can you design this learning experience, or can you write this letter or this lesson plan? But it's important to remember that it can go further than that. You can specifically say, can you create an extension for this that will help my learners reach a deeper understanding? And the more you ask it, the more specific you are, oftentimes the better the response is. So definitely want to say it is a springboard. It is not like, don't take everything that it says and assume that it is correct or good. But what do you guys think about using it as a springboard for creating meaningful extensions for our learners? As I kind of wait for you to tell me what you think about using it to create extensions, I do want you to know that as far as depth and complexity and the icons go, if you don't know this, Jay Taylor is the resource for that. If you haven't heard of the depth and complexity icons, you guys check them out. Depthcomplexity.com is a great place to start. I think that's their website, Depth Complexity. I don't think there's an .com. Lots of great resources. So yes, Karen, explore it further. Let me know what you think. And, I just think it's great for like, if you can, I just know there's those times when I'm like, oh, I can't think of an idea and I just need somewhere to start. And that's a great place to do that. Okay. I could spend all night talking about that, but I'm going to move on. Okay. If you want to know more about designing for depth, there's a book, right? And so you guys can check that out. We released this book, I think in December. It's very, it is kind of broad. It is just kind of a big picture view of how we can design for depth in the classroom. But I think for educators who are just getting started working with gifted learners or just need some really simple ideas, definitely something to consider. So you guys check that out. You can find it on Amazon. You can buy it through my publisher. It's on my website as well. So shameless plug. All right. Productive struggle. This is something that, again, I think we need to be thinking about at the beginning of the year, because productive struggle isn't always going to just happen for our gifted learners. It's something we have to be intentional about and something that we have to really think through. So how do we do that? What does that look like? Well, first of all, I actually had ChatGPT write this definition. Productive struggle refers to the process of actively grappling. I love that so much. Actively grappling with challenging tasks, problems, or concepts in order to deepen understanding and develop new skills. Here's why I love that definition. I love it because, number one, I think I can get a mental picture of what productive struggle looks like, right? That idea of actively grappling. But I also love that it tells us why productive struggle is important, because it helps our learners reach a deeper understanding, right? We have surface level learning. There is also deep understanding, and productive struggle can often move our kids from that surface level to getting to that deeper level of understanding. And I think that's huge. So productive struggle, let's talk a little bit about how we can make that happen and why it's important. When we think about our gifted learners, I do think it's key that we think through what's the difference between productive struggle and frustration, because there is a difference, right? They're not the same. I do think there is a line that can be crossed when it comes to letting our kids struggle. And this summer I was working with teachers, and this one teacher said, the most brilliant thing to me, and I thought it made so much sense. She said, Andy, I think about it this way. Productive struggle is action, right? My learners are still moving forward. Frustration is an emotion. So if we think of productive struggle as an action and frustration as an emotion, I think that can give us clarity around when we are in each one of those, right? This is what productive struggle looks like. This is what frustration looks like. And we've got action and emotion. And I just thought that made so much sense, and definitely something that I wanted to share with you guys. When we think about helping our learners and supporting them when we're designing learning experiences and kind of encouraging productive struggle or helping it happen, I love this idea of when you're designing a learning experience to think through not only guiding questions but also supporting questions. And here's what I mean by that. I had a teacher, I don't remember, I think it was last year, but she stayed after one of my sessions and she said, hey, one of my gifted learners came to me and they were really frustrated because they said, when I walk by their desk, I never stop and ask questions. And she said, but Andy, I don't stop and ask questions because I feel like she already knows what she's doing. Every time I walk by her desk, she's already doing what she's supposed to be doing. What am I going to stop and ask her? Like, I don't want to insult her. And she's very gifted and she's always ahead of where we are. And I started thinking about that. And I, number one, thought, you know what? I think I did that sometimes in my own classroom. But as I was talking to that teacher, I said, look, I think we have to think through when you're designing a learning experience, what are the guiding questions, right? Let's go back to that. We talked about GPS earlier. Sometimes my GPS comes on and it says, hey, there's a barrier up ahead or there's a faster way to get there. That's when it's guiding me. But sometimes my GPS comes on and it always comes on during the best song, like interrupts the best part. And it says, hey, you're still on the fastest route, or you're still on the best route. And it's just supporting me. It's just saying, hey, Andy, I see you. I'm still here. I'm tracking where you're going, but you don't really need me to tell you anything different because you're already taking the best route. And I think sometimes we have to do that for our gifted learners too, right? Sometimes I have to guide my learners and say, hey, we're trying to go from here to here, and I need to get you where you need to be. And a guiding question can do that. But I also think it's important to think about supporting questions. And this is just designed to support learners in the direction that they're already going, right? It's just acknowledging the work that's being done and supporting them so that they feel seen. I can't tell you how many gifted learners I talk to that say, I just don't feel seen, right? I don't even know if my teacher knows I'm in class. And so when you're designing those learning experiences for your students, don't just think through the guiding questions that you're going to ask. Also take time to think about what are some supporting questions I'm going to ask. What am I going to ask the learners that are already doing what they're supposed to be doing, or really don't need me to guide them, but they deserve to feel seen and supported? What do you guys think about that? About making sure that we're thinking through both types of questions, guiding and supporting questions. Does that make sense? That's obviously my favorite question tonight. Does it make sense? I'm just hoping words are coming out. I should have had a Dr. Pepper before I did this webinar, but I did not. So I hope words are coming out as sentences. Okay, so as you guys respond to that, I will keep going just for the sake of time. Here are just 3 practical strategies that you can use to make productive struggle a priority in the classroom. First of all, I love the idea of a pre-mortem strategy. If you haven't heard of this, I learned about this from one of my favorite educators, Dawn Wettrick. I owe so much of the work that I do now to Dawn. And so a pre-mortem strategy is this idea of before a learner works on a project or before they go to tackle something that could include some barriers or obstacles, you give them time to kind of think through that. Like you let them pretend that the project has failed or it has died and think through what they could have done differently. Or they can think through the things that might kind of kill their idea, or might letting them think through what are the obstacles I'm going to come across and how can I turn those obstacles into opportunities. But they do that on the front end of a learning experience instead of just letting it happen. And I think that can be really helpful for gifted learners, because when they acknowledge on the front end, like, oh, I already knew this was going to happen, or I saw this coming, it can help them address those things, not from a place of panic, but from a place of really thoughtfulness and knowing, hey, I knew this was going to happen, and here's what I thought. Here's what I'm going to do because it happened. So, pre-mortem strategy, you guys can Google it. It's a very cool idea that they use in the business world, but definitely check that out. My favorite no, there's a great YouTube video on this idea where you can see it in action. If you haven't heard of my favorite no, it's where you don't just celebrate correct answers, but you also celebrate your favorite incorrect answer. So you might, instead of celebrating the product or the outcome of the work, you celebrate the work itself. Like, hey, you didn't get the right answer, but I love the way you were thinking. Or, oh my gosh, I love that you worked through this with such precision or such thoughtfulness. And celebrating that favorite no helps our learners see, like, oh, it's not always about just getting the right answer. Sometimes it's about the process and not the product, which is huge and really something they need to understand. And then lastly, just celebrating struggle. Be intentional about that. Give opportunities at the end of the day for your students to say, hey, here's where I struggled today. And then as a class, celebrate that struggle and say, oh my gosh, even though that was hard for you, we just want to celebrate the fact that you were willing to walk through it and that you came out on the other side a better learner and understanding it in a deeper way because of that. So intentional times to celebrate struggle can be a great way to kind of make that happen as well. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about in our last 5 minutes are the social emotional needs of gifted learners. You guys, serving gifted learners goes so far beyond just creating projects and extensions. And I think sometimes people don't realize that. It's about understanding who they are and what they experience so that we can give them the tools that they need to learn and grow. And so a couple of big conversations that I had this summer that I wanted to share with you guys. Number one, helping gifted learners understand the difference between mastery and perfectionism, because sometimes they don't know the difference, right? They get so caught up in thinking that they have to do things perfectly. And then sometimes when they hear us talk about perfectionism as a negative thing, they think, oh, wait a second, I'm not supposed to want to do things well. Like, no, we're both of these things, perfectionism and mastery, both are aiming for excellence. And there is nothing wrong with that. I think to tell our gifted learners anything different is wrong. Both of these are wanting to achieve excellence, but mastery understands that achieving excellence is a journey. There's going to be obstacles on that journey, and I want to be able to turn those obstacles into opportunities. Perfectionism assumes that journey should not have obstacles. And if there is something that's in the way, it should have never been there to begin with. And so I love the idea of creating a Venn diagram with your learners and having this conversation early on in the school year. Look, I, as your teacher, we as your parents want to have high expectations, but we don't want to have unrealistic expectations. And I think mastery operates through the lens of high expectations. Perfectionism operates through that lens of unrealistic expectations, and we want to make sure they know the difference. So letting them create a Venn diagram and letting them make those connections can be really helpful and definitely something to consider from the social emotional aspect of meeting gifted learners' needs. If you guys have not heard of digital calming rooms, do yourself a favor, Google digital calming rooms and click the first thing that comes up. There's a great example of one. I love this because one of the rooms that I show all the time, the first sentence says something like, it's something to it's like, find your calm. And I love that because it's not about me telling them how to calm down. It's about them figuring out how they're going to calm down. And there's different things like animal live cams, breathing exercises, create places for them to create. There's music, but they can decide, hey, in this moment, what do I need to calm down? And so sometimes when that intensity that we talked about earlier in the webinar, when that becomes a thing, these digital calming rooms can be helpful because I can hand a kid an iPad and give them the digital calming room. And that's a very private exchange. It's not about the whole class needs to know that you need to go to the calming space in our room. It's, hey, you need a second. I'm going to give you this, and you choose how you want to find calm. And I think that just respects them as a learner. So what do you guys think about digital calming rooms? Definitely something maybe that you could utilize. I like the idea of hanging up QR codes in your room that connect to these. I learned about digital calming rooms from Amy Storer and Diane Wilson, Tech Care Twins. They're amazing. You guys check them out. But they shared these with me, and I have been sharing them with anybody that will listen. They have some great resources, so definitely follow up on that idea of digital calming rooms and see what you think about them. All right, as we wrap up, I just want to tell you guys, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I just appreciate you spending, what is it? Was it a Wednesday? A Wednesday evening with me late in the evening. I just appreciate you guys, and the Meaningful Mess community means the world to me. So I wanted to give you an opportunity. If you want to utilize any of the resources that I shared tonight, they're all over in my store. So you can just go to andymcnair.com/store. And if you use the code, and it's all caps, Road Trip Webinar, you'll get 10% off of anything in that store. I will be, Amanda, at NAGC this year. Brian Housen and I are doing a workshop or a session. There's several of us doing a session on artificial intelligence at the beginning of the conference, and Brian and I are doing a session on boredom together. So we're super excited about that. Karen, definitely check out the digital calming rooms. You will love them. Okay, so you guys go to the store, decide what you are interested in. The only thing that's not 10% off are any of the payment plans, but all of the other things that you just pay for outright, those are there. Amanda, make sure you come say hi. I can't wait to see you there for sure. Last thing that I want to share is just my contact information. You guys, I share most of my content on Instagram, so make sure you follow me there at A Meaningful Mess. I'm on Twitter at McNair. It's actually not Twitter anymore. I'm on X, which seems so weird to say. And then you can email me or check out my website at andymcnair.com. So, oh my gosh. So I'm sweating. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I hope it was worth your time. I hope you got some things that you can use. Please email me or connect with me if you have any questions at all. I want to be able to support you in any way that I can. So thank you guys again. I'll get some rest tonight, and I can't wait to connect and learn more with you. Let me say one more thing before you log off. I'm going to be doing these webinars once a month. And then I will be doing meetups for us to just have conversation over in my community. So you can find all of that over on my website. But my next webinar will happen next month. So stay tuned, and that'll be available soon. Oh, gosh, you guys are so sweet. I appreciate you. Y'all get some rest for sure. And I'll talk to you soon. All right. Bye, y'all.